I'm in a lot of these shots. This is what I looked like 12 years ago. Wow. Just wow. This was all the footage from my memories in Burbank, California, in the Burbank punk scene that I had preserved over time. Was this music scene bougie in a lot of ways? Yes, it was, especially compared to the rest of the LA punk scene scattered throughout the area. And not everyone in the punk scene was super bougie, but this is from my perspective only. Some of these shots are not mine, but of course some of these shots are mine. If you know the person who took some of these shots, feel free to drop them in the comments section and I'll add them to a list of credits in the description. I wish I kept most of the raw footage because this is a compilation of shots from that scene. And as you can see, that scene was more than just a punk scene. It was mainly a community of music lovers. I wish that I kept more from this period. I remember people saying that they wanted to work on a documentary about the Burbank punk scene around this specific time at one point. And I wish that I had that kind of footage so I can edit it now with the technical and editing know-how that I have currently. So if I were to give like a history of the Burbank punk scene throughout 2011 and 2012, it was mainly a bunch of people throughout Burbank, California who were previously in the metal scene. And some people were still metalheads even throughout the longevity of the Burbank punk scene. People were getting into skater punk, hardcore punk, reggae, ska, crust punk, grindcore, and a lot more other subgenres of punk rock. There was a lot of community affiliations with other music scenes in the general area as well as other communities, such as the San Gabriel punk scene, the Antelope Valley punk scene, the Northridge punk scene, and the general San Fernando Valley punk scene, which we kind of hailed from a little bit. Understanding that Burbank, California is part of the San Fernando Valley punk scene, we were almost kind of mutually exclusive from each other. Whereas the San Fernando Valley punk scene was much more developed over time, our scene was something that people saw and were like, hey, that's kinda cool, I guess. Alright, well, when's the next show? Like I said earlier, a lot of the previous Burbank bands were mostly metal bands that mainly inspired this scene, and a lot of punks in this scene very much had a love for metal still. It was just very common for metal heads as well as metal bands to be on the same bills and attending the same shows as punk bands and ska bands. And even occasionally there would be hip-hop groups and EDM artists in the same bills. It was just a really interesting time for us where a lot of local and flourishing subcultures were getting known, and even queer and trans feminist folks were getting some good spotlight. It was pretty uniting actually. Although a lot of us were still very reactionary and still unpacking a lot of extremely toxic behavior of our own, whether it be racism, homophobia, or toxic masculinity. And even with the inclusive nature of our scene, there was still a lot of transphobia involved at play here. I say that we were young and that we were learning about who we were and our roles in the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that our behavior should be excused or just shrugged off. It was just something that we were kind of inhibiting for a while, and it was pretty shitty, myself included. Some of the bands involved in the scene include Lockjaw, the nerd punk band, Pathetico Mondo, the ska punk band, also my band, it was. The Peaks were a punk band from Providence High School, which is a Catholic school. The singer really liked to talk about how his dad was a member of the punk band called the Dills, so there's that. And then there's the Defenestration Act. Most people don't know about the Defenestration Act because the Defenestration Act didn't really play shows with any of the other punk bands in the scene, but they were from Burbank partially, and also from El Monte. And I would also advise people who are from the Burbank punk scene at that time to go look up the Defenestration Act if you haven't already heard of them. They're pretty good, especially for that time.
they're going down. Beat them to the ground. Oink, 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 wide mouth again. Oink, 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 wide mouth again. Oink, 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 wide mouth again. Oink, 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 wide mouth again.
Out of all of the punk bands, Lockjaw lasted the longest, having played for over a decade, with a little bit of a hiatus between 2012 and 2014. My band, Patetico Mondo, was the first to really end, and the members of the band, including myself, would branch off into other projects, such as Autistic Chainsaw, which was my other ska band that formed in 2012, and the rest of the members would form an anarchist vegan ska band, No Excuse. The Peaks would eventually die off after. Interestingly, the Defenestration Act would prevail after several hiatuses, and it's kind of impressive that even though that the Defenestration Act didn't last as long as Lockjaw, the Defenestration Act has really prevailed over the years. And I think that it's important that we talk about how these bands that I just mentioned aren't the only bands to be recognized in the scene. In fact, there are currently still bands today still prevailing at a massive scale, including Nogue, Raptors, and the Screaming Skulls. Oh yeah, and Rascal Stew. All of these new bands keep the scene alive. And I think that's really to say that music scenes evolve over time. Music scenes really do develop into different peoples and different music cultures, and I think that's for the better. When people say that there's no good new music nowadays, I think they need to look at their local music scenes, because that's where they're gonna find the good stuff. They're not gonna find the good stuff by looking at the charts, although sometimes the good stuff is on the charts. But if you're looking for something more contemporary that is on par with some of the classics that you still fond over on a nostalgic level, well, I think you need to look underground. I think you need to look at your local community and music scenes and support them. Stay for the whole damn show. Pay for your tickets. Respect the venue. Respect the people who go to these shows, because this is their space to be able to truly express themselves and be themselves. Because sometimes people do need to have that escapism from the rest of the world, as the world is developing into a really cruel place. And if you're contributing to making the scene worse, then that form of escapism and safe space from the rest of the world, then the inclusive nature of the scene is not really present anymore. And that's why if you're gonna be in the scene, you gotta do your part, at least a little bit, to make sure that the scene thrives and stays alive. This is just a subjective opinion, but most people say that punk rock is just doing whatever the fuck you want, and maybe for some people it truly is just that. But how I understood punk scene, especially growing up into the punk scene from the metal scene, is that punk was mainly for people who didn't fit in with the rest of the world. So to speak, punk rock was for the black sheep, the sheep that didn't really fit in. And I think we should try to keep it that way. More inclusive for those who don't fit in to this already heteronormative society. And I think that's it. That's all I really want to say. Thanks for listening. Take care.